Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 259, Hernando de Soto. The last time I did one of these super biographical deep dives, it was on Leonardo da Vinci. And the reason I chose da Vinci, well, apart from the obvious, the inherent genius, is he's really kind of emblematic of the time period. Every once in a while, someone comes along and you can just say, that's Renaissance. Oh, Richard the Lionheart, that's high Middle Ages right there. Like, here is somebody who just stands for an era. Hernando de Soto might not seem like the obvious choice for the age of the conquistador. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, he's unsuccessful. He never finds a mythical golden civilization in the American Southeast because there isn't one and there never was one. Of course, he didn't know that, nor did anybody else in Europe know that at the time. As I'll mention a couple of times during this deep dive episode, it is amazing to think about how little Europeans, even 30 years after Columbus, how little they still knew about this new world. Frankly, much of what separates Cortés and Pizarro from Hernando de Soto is luck. Pizarro and Cortés both happened to stumble upon legitimate advanced Mesoamerican civilizations. Both of those civilizations had peasants who paid taxes, and that taxes could be turned into luxury goods, and that's what they're essentially looking for. They just want a system that they can co-opt. They don't want to build one. De Soto tries to find one, and he fails. But the spirit with which he engages this enterprise is so telling when you look at this period of, let's say, 50 years. And the sorts of people who are willing to cross the Atlantic, who are willing to murder, who are willing to rape and pillage, to try to become super wealthy, but not just that, famous. Because inherent to De Soto's quest through the Americas is a desire to be El Cid, is a desire to be this mythical Reconquista-like figure. That he fails in this enterprise, I don't think that necessarily makes him any less of a symbol of what it means to be a conquistador. We know very little about Hernando de Soto's youth. We know next to nothing about his upbringing, family life, or really anything about the 14-ish years he spent in Spain, which, for Soto, amounts to about a third of his life. We're not even sure when he was born. In 1535, he testified that he was, quote, 35 years old, more or less, end quote, which suggests he was born somewhere between 1496 and 1500. Garcilasco de Vega, a 16th century biographer of Soto, firmly states that he was 42 when he died on May the 21st, 1542. Thus, if we believe him, and I really don't have any reason not to, Soto was born in the year 1500. He was born the son of a Spanish hidalgo, a sort of cross between a medieval knight and a country squire. Soto was most likely born in Jerez de los Caballeros, a fortified market town with, in the early 16th century, a population of around 8,000. Jerez was then situated about 70 miles northwest of Seville, very close to the Portuguese border. As to his family, we know little more than the names of his parents, siblings, and a rough genealogy. Soto had at least 3 siblings, including an older brother. After leaving home at the age of 14, Soto spent no more than a few weeks in Jerez de los Caballeros for the balance of his life. Yet, like many conquistadors, Soto always held a strong attachment to his hometown. In 1539, Soto ordered in his will that 2,000 ducats be spent constructing a lavish chapel in Jerez. First and foremost, Hernando de Soto was influenced by the region he grew up in, Extremadura. Called the cradle of the conquistadors in tourist brochures, this desolate province in southwest Spain produced not only de Soto, but Hernán Cortés, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, Francisco Pizarro and his brothers, and many, many others. One in all 6 Spaniards who sailed to the Indies in the 16th century came from Extremadura, including half of Soto's 600 to 700 men who would go to La Florida. Survival of the fittest in Soto's world began at birth. Half of all children born in Renaissance Europe died before the age of 5, most within minutes or hours of leaving the womb. Millions more died of disease, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, diphtheria, measles, mumps, smallpox, and plague. Aided and sometimes caused by the filth and cramped conditions Soto and nearly other child in Europe grew up with during the 16th century. Indeed, Jerez de los Caballeros was not a pleasant town of whitewashed houses and scrub-clean streets that you would see today if you go there. It was a barely tolerable place where 8,000 people squeezed inside a walled area less than 1/10 of 1 square mile. Here, Soto and the citizens of Jerez lived amongst a maze of narrow streets, reeking of garbage and excrement, where one sometimes had to step carefully to avoid sewage running down in the troughs in the lanes and alleys, left open in part so that edible refuse could be thrown in and eaten by dogs, chickens, and goats. Houses were also tiny and cramped, with all but the very rich living in small, cave-like townhouses, where bedrooms were barely big enough for beds, and dining rooms were not much larger, leading most of the people to spend their time in small gardens or in one of the city's 3 open plazas. Why the people of Jerez tolerated such extreme discomfort was simple. It was far more dangerous to be outside the city walls. In Soto's day, the countryside of Spain and most of Europe was virtually lawless, a place where uninhibited thickets and forests predominated over pastures and cultivated fields, and where bandits, renegade bands of soldiers, and wild animals made even daylight travel hazardous. During the era of Soto's birth and early life, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel were making significant inroads towards mitigating this anarchy. Yet nearly every person in Spain remained instinctively fearful of the countryside, making sure that they were safe within the walls of any town or city by the time the sun fell below the horizon. This meant that peasants ventured out to work their fields only during daylight hours, and wealthier people left towns and cities only when properly armed. The rest of the time, the Sotos, like most Hidalgos, stayed in town, sleeping in their tiny house inside Jerez's cocoon of stone and mortar, hiring an overseer and perhaps armed watchman and guard to manage their pastures, vineries, olive groves, or whatever else they owned. Making matters worse, the late 15th century saw a series of droughts hit Spain. Spain was then, and to an extent is now, overwhelmingly rural. So drought led to famine. Famine led to death. In other words, it would have been clear to a young Soto that there was no future for him in Extremadura. The other question that gets asked about every conquistador, and Soto is no exception, so I'll talk about it now, is, were they religious? Was Hernando de Soto a religious man? For Soto, I guess it's impossible for me to say. Sure, he writes about God in his letters, but that was, to a large extent, just a given in 16th century Europe. He brought at least 8 priests with him to La Florida, but they never appear in the narrative. He did talk about religion with the natives of La Florida and beyond, but always within the context of power and authority. If pressed, I would say that Soto probably used religion more as justification for his actions than religion was the driving force behind those actions. But again, I'm guessing at that. The last ingredient in Soto's formative years would have to have been his formal education. He was a hidalgo, so he would have gotten some formal education. Unlike Pizarro, he was certainly a literate man. Book learning, however, would have been only considered a small part of any hidalgo's education. Given Soto's later reputation as a horseman and fighter, he clearly received some significant instruction on riding and fighting at an early age. More than anything, being a hidalgo was abiding by a set of beliefs, a set of ideals. Soto still would have seen himself as an extension of El Cid, the mythical knight of the Reconquista. He was to be chivalrous, adventurous, and fiercely loyal to Castile. As to that final piece, he would have seen any actions he took to further Castile's interest as justified. There was no separation between what was best for Hernando de Soto and what was best for Castile. They were one and the same. Hence, his never-ending quest for another empire of gold. The quest that will, as we will see, consume Soto's entire life. Of course, by Soto's day, the Reconquista was over. Hidalgos were not local fighters anymore, so much as they were becoming Spain's professional military class. A class that now was to fight Spain's enemies in foreign wars. Think less Moors and more the French in northern Italy. For these men, these hidalgos, the New World meant a lot more than just a chance to get rich. It was a chance to capture some of this adventurous spirit, to be El Cid one last time, to make their fortunes, and of course, to kill the unbelievers of Christ. These were now Indians and not Moors, and that change seemingly made very little difference to these men. So it was that sometime in his early teens, Hernando de Soto packed up what few belongings he had and left for home. Chances are that he was not traveling alone, but likely alongside a local captain responding to a recruitment call. Unfortunately, we have no record of when and how Soto left home. All we know is that he went to Seville, Spain's only legal point of disembarkation for what was then called the Indies. From the time Soto left home until our next mention of him in 1517 in Panama, we have no information directly about the young man. Thus, we have around 3 years that we cannot account for. It is likely, though not certain, that Soto sailed with a major Spanish fleet under the command of Pedro Arias de Villa, Balboa's partner in the conquest of Panama. There were rumors of gold in Panama at the time and an easy life. And that probably explains why Soto, and so many others, wound up going there. But of course, we can't be sure. This expedition was a bit of a mess from the get-go. King Ferdinand planned it to be the first really major colonialization effort of the New World. 2,000 colonists were supposed to make their way to Panama and set up the first major Spanish colony on the mainland. There were some colonies in Hispaniola, but nothing really in what was today Central or South America. But it was a disaster. The people who signed up to go were, by and large, well-dressed Europeans unprepared for the challenges of the New World. Plus, when the captains went to load their ships, they discovered there was not enough room for everyone, something they should have already known. They got some extra ships, not an easy task given the initial effort, had already strained Ferdinand's treasury to such a point that 2 years later he would die in debt. But they got them and cut back on enough personnel that there was room for everyone. The fleet finally set sail on April the 11th, 1514, and sighted today what is the Dominican Republic on June the 2nd of that same year. From the Dominican Republic, the fleet's next stop was the Gulf of Santa Marta on the north coast of Colombia. For 3 days, they harassed local natives, burning huts, plundering gold trinkets, capturing slaves, and twice fighting pitch battles that quickly dissolved into massacres. One Indian captured was a princess found hiding in a thicket by an African slave belonging to another young Spaniard, a future historian actually, named Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo. He had actually come along as a minor official to serve in the government. He says this girl was, quote, 16 or 17 years old, and as fair-skinned as a Castilian. She was quite naked, but held herself with such grave pride that she gave an impression of dignity, end quote. Later, this same man, Oviedo, would criticize Soto and others of gross mistreatment of the Indians, though in this case, his behavior is hardly better. Spiriting away his quote-unquote princess from Santa Marta, he reports that she soon after died in the town of Darien. He says of heartbreak. I say probably not. Nearly 2 weeks after departing Santa Marta on June the 26th, most of the Armada finally dropped anchor in the Gulf of Uraba, off the Darien region of Panama. If anyone was on hand to greet them, there is no record. The settlement itself stood 3 to 4 miles on a height above the fetid coast swamps and out of the sight of the beach and the mosquitoes. Nor do we know the colonists' reaction as they crowded onto the decks to stare at what amounted to a nondescript stretch of sand, bordered by palms and topped off by the Serrana de Darien, a mountain range, its 6,000-foot peaks undoubtedly obscured by wisps of fog. Sold on the notion that this was a paradise on earth, or at least a reasonable copy of the same, most of the settlers must have been stunned by what they saw. Where, they asked, was the great capital of gold? Where were the docks, the houses, the ships? Where was the treasury full to the brim? Even more distressing was the intense, superheated humidity settling over the ships. On a map, if you look at the Gulf of Uraba, it looks like a long finger of water wedged between the northwest coast of South America and the narrow isthmus of Panama, trapped between two mountain ranges with low, steamy swamps on either side, the murky Atrato River disgorging mud and water to the south. This region draws heat to it like a sponge. For those used to a drier and more temperate climate, i.e. Spain, sudden immersion is miserable. You can become nauseous without difficulty. Your fingers swell. Headaches are an easy side effect. And if the heat were not enough, the settlers that first night discovered another prominent feature of the ecology of this region of the world: the mosquito. Swarms of them, no doubt, feasted happily on the sweat, filth, and blood of so many people crammed aboard 24 wooden vessels, awaiting their orders to disembark. In 1514, the Spanish were convinced that Darien was overflowing with gold. This mistake, and mistake it was, actually originated with Christopher Columbus. In 1502, he explored the coast of Central America on his fourth and final expedition, the one where he ends up shipwrecked. And he claimed that there was a, quote, vast quantity of gold, end quote, in the interior of the isthmus with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Upon arrival, Pedro Davila, he's also called Pedrarias in some of the sources, so the names are interchangeable, but I'm going to try to use Davila most commonly from here on out, just to be consistent, but just know that he is referred to by more than one name in the historical sources if you look him up. So upon arrival, he's intent on finding Balboa, who is the present governor of Panama, because Davila is supposed to take over for him. Bartolomé de las Casas, who was with Davila, recorded what happened next. He asked, quote, "Where is Vasco Núñez de Balboa?" A man said, quote, "There he is," pointing to a man dressed in a cotton blouse over a linen shirt, wearing hemp sandals and coarse breeches, who was looking on and, simultaneously helping, his slaves thatch a house. The messenger was taken aback by such a plainly dressed man. He could not believe that this was Vasco Núñez, whose exploits and riches were so famous in Castile that he had expected to see him seated on a majestic throne. This scene and meeting is often played up in a lot of the histories that I read to use usual literary tropes to play Vasco de Núñez de Balboa as sort of the foil to Davila. Davila is the stiff-shirted, he is the bureaucrat, he has no experience in the New World, he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. Balboa is the salt of the earth man who's come to try to make this settlement function. There's elements of truth to the way that this is portrayed, but just understand that in many of the historical sources, it's played up dramatically. Now, in 1514, Vasco Núñez de Balboa, a man who was going to have a huge influence on a young Soto, was about 40 years old. According to one, he was, quote, "handsome of face and figure, very tall and well-built, clean-limbed and strong," end quote. He was always famous for his fair skin and his bright red hair and beard, which was, of course, unusual in Spain. He was born and raised in Soto's own hometown, Jerez de los Caballeros, apparently in Soto's own home parish of San Miguel. Balboa departed Spain in 1500, the year that Soto was born, to explore the coast of Colombia. Eventually, he ended up on Hispaniola, where he bought a plantation and tried to settle down. His efforts to raise pigs, however, not only led to mounting debts, but also to a fervent desire to get away from pigs. In 1510, hounded by creditors and legally unable to depart the island without first paying off his loans, Balboa escaped by hiding in a barrel as a stowaway aboard a ship headed for Panama. Firm, energetic, and cunning, Balboa shared the King Ferdinand's belief in ruling through a shrewd mix of benevolence and cruelty, reward and punishment. That first night, Balboa made a room in his own home for Davila and his wife, Isabella de Bobadilla. A few days later, the governor returned his favor by turning out his host and appropriating most of the former acting governor's property. That is to say, once Davila was welcomed into Balboa's home, he simply took it as his own. Meanwhile, Davila assigned quarters to officials and nobles in the homes of Balboa's chief men, while common soldiers seized Indian homes in the town, forcing many of the natives out into the bush. The remaining colonists probably slept on the ground, wrapping themselves in their expensive cloaks until tents and other supplies could be unloaded from the ships. Among them, De Soto undoubtedly spent his first night in Darien sleeping under the stars, if that is, he slept at all. Most of the men who had reached Darien had to sleep on the ground. As I said, Soto most certainly slept outside. Balboa had to make room for Davila in his own house. In other words, land of gold and pleasure, Darien was not. Davila was to be the governor of this fledgling colony, whose boundaries were extremely vaguely defined on the map. Armed with about 2,000 settlers, he was supposed to transform it into New Spain. It didn't take long for things to go sideways. The resources of this small colony of a few hundred were already stretched thin. So the arrival of 2,000 settlers who had no idea how to support themselves was not a benefit. In fact, it was perhaps the final nail in the coffin. The newcomers were able to eat the ship's provisions at first, but these ran out after a month. The colony was then hit hard by sickness, probably typhoid, maybe bubonic plague. By midsummer, 15 to 20 settlers were dying per day. And what did Davila do in the early days of this crisis? Well, nothing. Then, after a freak fire burned down the shack containing the king's provisions, leaving even him and his cronies without food, the old governor panicked, responding to the gathering disaster with a hastily arranged strategy of dispatching fighting men to fan out in all directions in search of food, which they were ordered to steal from the Indians, along with whatever gold they found. This remedy, however, merely added to the catastrophe as the poorly disciplined soldiers sent off to strip bare the countryside unleashed a bloodbath of looting, killing, slave-taking, and destruction, attacking what would have been Balboa's native friends, and utterly ignoring the requirements of the requerimiento and other finely crafted documents. Overnight, this wanton destruction transformed a region that had hitherto been very peaceful into one dominated by terror, kidnapping, skirmishes, chaos, blood, and incessant Indian attacks. One Spanish chronicler described that first year in Darien as, quote, hellish hunting, end quote. Within a decade, the predominant native culture in the region was essentially eliminated. Throughout this first year, there is nothing we can say about Soto. In 1517, we could at last place him on a specific expedition. Assuming he was born in 1500, he would have been 17 years old. We have no details about Soto's role in what was a disaster. Most likely, he was a common soldier, doing his best to follow orders, and especially with the difficulty that after incessant native attacks, the floods started. The floods effectively ended the expedition that Soto was on, which we assume was one of the ones Davila ordered to go out and get food. He seemingly was trapped on what had been a very tranquil river, but when the monsoon rains hit, river flooded, turned fast, canoes capsized, and many Spaniards were killed. Soto, of course, was not. The debacle meant that this particular expedition was finished, the imperative being for everyone who was still alive to just escape back to the main town. It wasn't easy, as they coasted down the flooded river, lacking food, and attacked repeatedly by Indians who badly, quote, knocked them about, end quote, according to Soto's friend. Several more Spaniards died in these battles. And to lead the men home, the men chose a dour 39-year-old veteran of the conquistador region who no one had ever heard of up till now. His name was Francisco Pizarro. We know him. And Soto's going to very soon. He just doesn't know that yet. In the end, the total take in plunder in this incredibly ridiculous and stupid fiasco was about 52 pesos worth of gold and no food. Other than this one expedition, the slate for Soto's participation in the Darien settlement is effectively blank. Only one chronicler even mentions Hernando de Soto in Darien, almost certainly because he was just too young and too insignificant. But that doesn't mean that the time in Darien wasn't important to Hernando de Soto. It was during these years in the, quote, school of Davila, end quote, that Soto first learned the brutal mechanics of conquest in the Indies. The basics of how to design a camp designed not to colonize, not to settle a place, but how to comb it efficiently and ruthlessly for slaves and treasure. He also learned how to equip an expedition, to organize a marching column of vanguard outriders, native porters, servants, and rear guard, to select the best men for his captains and scouts, to keep his soldiers, horses, and war dogs healthy by living off food plundered from the Indians, to gather intelligence properly on his intended victims, and to act pragmatically in almost any situation. But even more important was Soto's continuing education in the mores of this era, a culture in which men like these, conquistadors, never doubted their right to lay waste to entire nations and peoples in their native homes, all in the name of profit, conquest, salvation, and glory. Indeed, De Villa's conquest by pillage and violence is essentially the story of El Cid and of knights errant throughout Europe. The point being that the wise men served in equal measure the king, God, his compañeros, and his own ambitions. Often those things were meant to be one and the same. We'll never know how many Indians died in Panama during Soto's teenage years. Oviedo, that historian from before with the princess, he says about 2 million died between 1514 and 1526. This is a number that is impossibly high and is in no way supported by the archaeological record. On the other hand, eyewitness accounts all claim that Panama in 1514 was mostly under cultivation or cleared for hunting, and that a sizable population lived in the interior of the Darien region. During these years, what we can say is that that population that cleared that land, that hunted that game, vanished. Pedro de Villa, or Pedrarias as he's oftentimes called in the records, was a spiteful man. He hated Balboa because Balboa had discovered the quote-unquote South Sea, the Pacific, which De Villa had expected to do. So, in anger, De Villa confiscated all of Balboa's property. Frankly, the only thing that's surprising about this part of the story is how long Balboa lasted after De Villa arrived. Balboa weathered these attacks as best he could, sending letters to the king insisting that De Villa was a terrible governor, someone who lacked the skills needed to make Darien a success, accusations which were almost certainly true. I do understand De Villa's feelings to an extent. He must have felt continuously upstaged by the more dashing, younger Balboa. And when news arrived in 1515 that King Ferdinand was dying, De Villa knew he could start to press his advantage. He realized that once Ferdinand died, the edges of the empire, which certainly Panama was, would not be anyone's concern. De Villa would be able to do what he wanted. So when Balboa came to De Villa and requested permission to found essentially a new colony, De Villa denied his request without so much as a second glance. Balboa made preparations to leave anyway, which infuriated De Villa. At this point, then, De Villa threw caution to the wind and accused Balboa of treason, placing him in chains. This was too much for Balboa's followers, who threatened to storm the prison. De Villa, however, moved too quickly for Balboa's unorganized supporters to act, moving his prisoner to the patio of his own mansion, where, under heavy guard, he incarcerated the governor of the South Sea in a cage, like some sort of wild animal. Here, Balboa remained for several weeks as De Villa tried to contain what loomed as a full-scale insurrection. As the crisis deepened, however, even a man as stubborn as De Villa realized that he had gone too far. This is particularly true after the intervention of his wife, who insisted he not only back down, but offer a gesture of reconciliation. Thus, one day in late 1515 or early 1516, De Villa stunned the colony again, not only releasing Vasco Núñez de Balboa from his cage, but also announcing that he and his rival had made peace, sealing the deal with a surprise announcement that Balboa would be betrothed to one of de Villa's 5 daughters, a teenager who happened to then be back in Spain. The colonists greeted this announcement first with astonishment, and then relief, though at least some must have realized that a quarrel as bitter as this could never be fully resolved, and, frankly, they were right. It was only a matter of time before these two men clashed again. Which side in all of this Soto supported, we don't know. Sure, he probably would have gravitated toward the young and dashing Balboa. But we do know that later in life, Soto's attachments were rarely ironclad. He is likely to have supported whichever side he thought would best serve his ambitions. What we do know is that Soto was then involved in joining Balboa's South Sea expedition. This was the expedition de Villa originally rejected, but upon Balboa's release, he had no choice but to assent. Certainly, Balboa's project had been made possible by his rapprochement with his now father-in-law, but de Villa could not help himself from making life difficult for his son-in-law, continuing to make it hard for him to acquire supplies and men, and giving him an almost impossibly short timeline of 18 months to set up a new functioning colony. Showing his usual pragmatism, Balboa didn't move immediately to the other sea. For several months, he had been building and organizing Acala, a settlement on the Caribbean side, 80 miles to the west of Santa Maria. Selected for a protected harbor and its location below the mountain passes leading south, Acala was ideal as a base of operation and would serve as a link with the outside world as soon as he set up a colony on the Pacific side. By delaying in Acala, Balboa was also playing his cards wisely. It gave him a chance to see if de Villa would actually stick to his policy of reconciliation, something he needed to be reasonably sure of before moving to the Pacific. There, he would be heavily dependent in the first few months on supplies and goodwill from the colonists back in Darien. Furthermore, Balboa may have lingered in Alcala hoping to hear from Spain, where he was convinced that Ferdinand's eventual successor would remove de Villa from his post and put someone there more to their personal liking. By late autumn 1517, when Soto returned from his original expedition, Alcala was already a small but reasonably prosperous community, quote, settled in the same manner as that of Darien, end quote, according to one eyewitness who said that the town was about several small huts and a church arranged around a central square and flanked by terraced foothills, where settlers and indigenous servants could grow corn, beans, yams, pineapples, and spices. Late November of that year, 1517, is probably the earliest that Soto could have reached Acala. By then, Balboa was finished with the city and preparing to launch a second stage of his colonial strategy. This was a policy of harvesting timber in the local hills. The idea was to build 4 brigantines and use those to explore a mysterious land to the south people were all of a sudden talking about. Apparently it was called Peru, where people, quote, eat and drink out of gold vessels, and gold is as cheap as iron is with you, end quote. This is an early reference, of course, to Peru. And if Balboa would have lived, there is all likelihood that he would have made the discovery ahead of Francisco Pizarro. Again, Soto's role in this expedition is unknown, but there's evidence that it was during this time that Soto first formed a pact of brotherhood with 2 men who are going to be really important in the story going forward. One is Francisco Compagnon, and the other was Hernan Ponce de Leon. These would launch what would become one of the most successful partnerships during the period of early conquista. Compagnon was Balboa's second in command. He was a steady, competent cavalryman who would seldom be away from Soto's side throughout the next decade. Hernan Ponce was quiet, but highly efficient young man who was good at organizing supplies. He was kind of like the Diego de Almagro to Soto, the way that that man had been to Francisco Pizarro. Later on, when we talk about Nicaragua, Soto would be the one who would earn distinction of these three men. But it was Compagnon who was actually the most important at this point because he efficiently set to building the boats. The problem with building the boats is that then you have to get the boats to the Pacific. And portaging 4 relatively large vessels isn't easy. By all accounts, this was a painstaking, horrific operation. Loading their Indian porters down with long, unwieldy planks weighing over 100 pounds apiece, Balboa and Compagnon forced hundreds of natives to walk in chain gangs until they dropped dead from exhaustion. All for a boat-building project in which the wood from the south coast would have worked just as well, frankly. According to De las Casas, at least 500 Indians died, and possibly, quote, in excess of 2,000, end quote. A carnage he blames both on Balboa and Compagnon, who he vilifies in his Historia as a chief executioner of the Indians. Soto didn't get mentioned, probably because he was just too insignificant at this time. Yet, he was certainly there, participating in a project that reveals a lot about Spanish attitudes and their assumption that it was normal to work hundreds of human beings to death purposely, valuing them as worth no more than a few days of hard labor before they expired and had to be replaced. That Soto shared this attitude is going to become abundantly clear when we get to La Florida, where several times he's going to overwork native porters, caring only about their demise because it means he's going to have to find more. That being said, for once, the Indians were not entirely alone in their suffering here. This is because Balboa, probably realizing his native porters were going to die before all the planks were transported over the mountains, ordered the Spaniards themselves to join in the expedition, transporting as well. In fact, Balboa himself picked up the first plank, hoisted it on his back, and began carrying it across. Normally, it would have been anathema for such a mundane task to have fallen to Spaniards. Remember, going to the New World was all about figuring out how to avoid physical labor for the rest of your life, not perform physical labor. As spring turned to summer, the hardships of this bloody portage across the isthmus merely became the first of several calamities that bedeviled this boat-building project. For starters, once the wood was delivered, Balboa found himself with only enough to build 2 brigantines, not 4. Next came the stunning revelation that the timber was honeycombed with worms and rot from seawater and therefore useless. Then, just as Balboa was rallying his men to cut fresh planks on the South Sea coast, which they could have done initially, the river nearby abruptly flooded, washing away all the newly cut wood and also the entire camp and all their provisions. For Soto, this must have seemed familiar, as the last expedition that he went on, probably the first real expedition that he went on, ended with a flooding river washing away most of the supplies and half of the men. Now, they were in a flooded valley with nothing to eat and no boats to make their escape. A situation that drove even the perennially optimistic Balboa to despair and considered abandoning his project. According to Las Casas, Balboa was forced to feed on roots, whence may be concluded how his men lived, not to mention the Indians. It was in the midst of this crisis that Compagnon volunteered to take a small squadron and comb the surrounding country for food. Ultimately, it was Francisco Compagnon who saved the entire expedition. He was able to locate a Native American settlement not far away after devising the means to cross a river by creating a small rudimentary bridge. And he was able to loot all of the food that they had, thus saving the expedition. It didn't take long then for Balboa to recover his composure, rebuild his camp, and begin cutting new timber. By the summer of 1518, he had launched 2 brigantines and was sailing with 100 men down the coast. We know he went up and down the Gulf. We know that he sailed to what are called the Pearl Islands. Today it's referred to as Isla del Rey. And that he launched several more brigantines and found out a whole bunch of new information about the Panama coast. That being said, did he find any gold? No. Did he find Peru? No. If he would have, he probably would have conquered it. Almost certainly, Hernando de Soto participated in some or even potentially all of these expeditions. In late 1518, the new king, Charles I, soon to be Charles V, finally named a replacement for Pedro de Villa. De Villa was furious. He fired off a message to Balboa and insisted that he return to Darien. Balboa, who thought that he was back in de Villa's good favor, complied. He was wrong. The moment Balboa arrived, an officer placed him under arrest. You may remember this from the Peru episodes, but that officer was Francisco Pizarro. It's interesting how all these connections come about. Remember, those two guys are from basically the same town. The charge was, as before, treason. This time, de Villa had Balboa imprisoned far from his supporters, so he could do with the man as he wished. The Chief Justice, firmly in de Villa's pocket, found Balboa guilty. De Villa did not attend Balboa's execution. Meanwhile, along the South Sea, Soto and the rest of Balboa's expedition waited anxiously for news. When it arrived, it was not the news they had been expecting. Balboa's death was certainly a blow, but it was also an important lesson for the young Soto. This was a wild world where power was local. If you could get away with something, then you could do it. The king was, after all, an ocean away. By 1519, Darien had become a prosperous town. But Soto spent little time there during this period. Instead, he was involved in the founding of a new capital, Panama City. Darien was more advantageous than Panama City in really all ways but one. Panama City was located on the narrowest part of the isthmus, where the Pacific Ocean is only 33 miles from the Caribbean Sea. And that advantage was decisive. Even today, about a fifth of Panama's population lives in this one city. On August the 15th, 1519, de Villa named Panama City the new capital of Panama. But Soto was not there for the ceremony. By then, restless as ever, he was gone. He was about 100 miles to the west, trying to organize resources around what was the best agricultural region in Panama. The man who he was with would also prove foundational for Soto. Gaspar de Espinosa, the Chief Justice of the colony, and the man who had previously ordered the execution of Balboa. Not only did Espinosa assign Soto to his first known command as a field captain, he was also the most systematic and efficient expedition leader Soto had yet served under. It was really a no-nonsense style of conquest that closely resembled the Soto's, especially his mature, methods of finally balancing friendship and cruelty, patience and sudden, unrelenting violence in dealing with local Indian leaders. Bartolomé de las Casas describes Espinosa in terms that sound a lot like Oviedo's description of Soto in Florida 2 decades later. Quote, "The lawyer Espinosa systematically killed Indians by setting some to the dogs, ordering others hung, and having others have their noses hacked off," end quote. Espinosa and Soto, though, were very different when it comes to temperament. Espinosa was cool, dispassionate. He was a conqueror lawyer. Soto was hot-headed and a reckless warrior. Yet both showed an uncommon mastery of the classic conquistador strategy against the Indians. Moreover, Soto's style was always more methodical and calculated than most who grew up under Pedro de Villa. As we'll see, He's going to make a name for himself, not only a virtuoso of the cavalry charge, but also a master negotiator, frequently called up in Nicaragua and Peru to parley with the Native Americans. In 1519, Espinosa's entrada returned to Panama City. That was in October, after securing the fealty of several local tribes and organizing food shipments from the region to the capital. Soto, however, didn't stay in Davia's new city for long. In 1520, he departed again for that same region, which was referred to as the Parita region, accompanying Espinosa's third and final campaign in western Panama. This time, the Chief Justice headed north into the mountains, above the flatlands. He planned not only to extend Spanish authority in the area, but also to chase down a rumor of copious amounts of gold hidden in the region. It was on this expedition that Soto suddenly becomes more than a name in an obscure archival document, and bursts forth from the pages of at least one conquista history in an incident where he not only proved himself a daunting fighter, but also managed to save Espinosa and his entire army from almost certain annihilation during an ambush deep in the interior. The expedition began in Panama City, with Espinosa dividing his army into two sections. The main group traveled by ship under his own command, while a smaller contingent of 100 men trekked overland. Led by Captain Francisco Pizarro, this smaller unit was further divided into a main army and a vanguard, later commanded by Soto, a position he would repeatedly hold for much of his career, most notably in Peru. Bartolomé de las Casas tells us the story of what happened several days out from Panama City, when Soto was leading the vanguard of 30 men. These were composed of a handful of horsemen, all the rest on foot. They were marching across wild, open foothills around the Tabasara Mountains, which are about 15 to 20 miles north of the Gulf of Pirata, which in and of itself, as the crow flies, is probably about 80 miles from Panama City. Apparently, Soto was reconnoitering this rugged country, which probably looked a lot like the hills around his hometown, when suddenly he heard the, quote, shouts and noise of battle, end quote, up ahead. Knowing that Espinosa's main force might be in the area, he gave the order for his men to rush forward. Las Casas says Soto then rode up to a height overlooking the valley, where he saw, to his horror, hundreds of Native American warriors, perhaps 1,000, and they had already pinned down Espinosa's forces. Trapped in a gully, one eyewitness says, quote, the Spaniards could make no use of their horses, which was a great disadvantage because the Indians lacked neither courage nor strength, end quote. Soto had several choices. The safest and most prudent would have been to ride back to Pizarro and summon the entire overland force as reinforcements. But Soto, making the kind of snap decision for which he would later become famous, chose instead the most dramatic, the most reckless option available. A witness tells us that he led his entire tiny force to bring unexpected help to Espinosa's forces, attacking directly into the rear of an army that outnumbered him as much as 30-1. A move foolhardy enough that it should have ended Soto's career right then and there. But skill and luck prevailed. Somehow, Soto caused enough confusion to force the Indians to pull back momentarily from their assault. Apparently, they believed themselves to be under the attack of a much larger contingent of Spaniards. This gave Espinosa's men time to erupt out of the valley and face down the warriors with their own horses, though the native army, once they realized their error, quickly re-engaged the Spaniards in a country still too rugged for the effective use of cavalry. Forcing them to retreat, the Indians harassed them, quote, with great vigor, end quote, as Espinosa's army withdrew to their ships. After being driven out of the mountains, Espinosa sailed a few miles down the coast, where he deposited Soto and around 50 men. The idea was for them to establish a tiny settlement. But no sooner had they done so than native warriors descended upon them. Soto escaped and with his men rode hard to Panama City. Later, de Villa would return to that same area with a larger force, which once again contained Hernando de Soto. After clearing out the locals once and for all, Soto and several other men settled down to live in the fertile region at the base of the Tabasara Mountains, around 100 miles southwest of Panama City on the Pacific Ocean. Soto would live there for the next 3 years. Then one day, in early 1520, word reached Panama of a startling discovery. Quote, "They call it Mexico," end quote. Further news rolled in from there about Cortez's arrival in 1519, his capture of Montezuma, his flight from Tenochtitlan, and his return. All of this filled everyone, Soto included, with wonder and desire. On June the 5th, 1523, another explorer showed up in Panama with another tale. His name, confusingly, was also de Villa, Gonzalez de Villa. He claimed to have discovered a new Mexico, a new land of gold, but this time to the south. It was the land of Nik-Alt-Nahuac, which he mispronounced as Nicaragua. Soto seems to have decided at once to join this expedition, being outfitted to return to and conquer this Nicaragua, this new kingdom full of gold. Now, I want to pause here because it is important to recognize at this point in history, remember, we're not yet 25 years into the 16th century yet. So, we're about 30 years removed from Columbus's first voyage of discovery. European understanding of the geography of the New World is still very, very rudimentary. And I want to point out that it isn't going to be until Lewis and Clark's expedition across North America in what is going to be the early 19th century, so almost 300 years from now, that modern Americans are going to have a full and complete understanding of the American West. So the fact that Europeans think that there are all these civilizations of gold isn't surprising. No one knew about Mexico, and Cortez stumbled upon that. Who's to say they can't stumble upon another advanced civilization? In fact, it stands to reason that there should be more. And so as we start to criticize Soto later on in this episode for foolishly following these dreams of cities of gold, remember that on several occasions, those rumors had turned out to be true. And if the upshot is that you become a multi-millionaire overnight by finding one of these civilizations, maybe it is worth looking. Regardless, Soto had lived in the same region for about 4 years now. His time there had been very profitable. But as I mentioned, he wanted the big payday, not just the safe life. He wanted an empire to conquer. By royal decree, Gonzalez de Villa held the concession from the crown to conquer Nicaragua. By the fall of 1523, however, several rivals were also organizing expeditions to invade Nicaragua and several other territories in Central America. This, of course, should go without saying, because I've talked about it a lot when we talked about the issue between Pizarro and Almagro in Peru. But let's just say that nobody exactly knew where the boundaries of Nicaragua began and ended. So who conquers what is, again, really a question of who gets there first. Now, the other rivals included not only Pedro de Villa back in Panama, but 2 captains of Hernan Cortez's sent out late in 1523 and early 1524 by Cortez himself on probing expeditions south of Mexico City. The first of these was Pedro de Alvarado, who we probably remember from those episodes, marching southeast near the Pacific coast with 500 men, headed toward what is Guatemala and El Salvador. Cristobal de Olid, the second of the rivals, led another 500 men as he marched across the Yucatan toward what would become Honduras. Soto joined another expedition, this one led by Hernandez de Cordoba and his business partner, Hernan Ponce, who was probably the one who negotiated Soto's participation. The country Cordoba planned to invade comprises one of the most fertile valleys in Latin America, a wide corridor of rich black soil, dark blue lakes, and a string of smoldering volcanoes stretching 250 miles along a major fault line just inside the Pacific coast. Few landscapes in Latin America impress the Spaniards more. The dramatic sweep of abrupt, steaming cones of volcanoes, some 5,000 or 6,000 feet high, the deep lagoons filling collapsed volcanoes, and an inland sea the size of Chesapeake Bay, which some of the Indians called Cocoboloca, and which the Spanish renamed El Mar Dulce, the freshwater sea. Las Casas, during a visit to Nicaragua in the late 1520s, called Nicaragua, quote, a paradise of God, end quote. Oviedo, our historian, called it, quote, the most beautiful and satisfying country to be found in the Indies, end quote. Late in 1523, Cordoba and his 230-man army boarded ships for Costa Rica, just south of Nicaragua. Sadly, what happens next is a bit of a mystery. There is no record of Cordoba's invasion of Nicaragua, but it's possible to at least construct a broad outline of what happened. He almost certainly encountered armed resistance from the moment he left his ships and marched inland. Soto was a quick and talented commander, and I have little doubt that Cordoba placed him in command of the lead battalion. As Soto stormed across the Great Valley, entering each new kingdom in turn, he first would have found himself on a dirt road, snaking through the wild, overgrown bands of forest and scrub that served as a buffer between new neighboring polities. Next, he would have entered partially burned and cleared land used for hunting, which gave way to farmsteads, small villages, and expansive fields of maize, beans, sweet potatoes, pineapple, papaya, avocado, and of course, cash crops, things like cotton, cacao, tobacco. Finally, Soto would have reached the chief city of the kingdom, where he and the army probably fought a decisive battle, crushing their native counterparts before marching down the narrow streets lined by the city's various homes, all constructed of whitewashed adobe and thatch. Eventually, these streets led to the invaders' city's central plaza, edged by small earth and stone pyramids and palaces. The powerful armies in the area of Nicaragua apparently succumbed quickly to the Spanish onslaught, though not without a fight. According to González de Villa, the largest city-states were capable of fielding armies of several thousand men, used to fighting in ordered ranks and battle formations, and armed with a formidable arsenal of clubs, stone-topped maces, slings, javelins, small bows and arrows, and swords carved out of wood and stone. The Nicaraguans also used armor, the rank and file dressing themselves in quilted cotton jerkins and heavy wooden helmets, the kings and generals wearing breast, arm, and leg plates made of gold. Given this formidable array of weaponry, it's surprising how quickly the highly disciplined armies of Nicaragua collapsed, apparently in just the matter of weeks. The explanation for this, however, lies not so much with gaps in technology, but with the Nicaraguan style of warfare. Over the centuries, it had evolved into an almost ceremonial exercise, fought less to conquer or kill an enemy than score some minor victories on matters of territorial disputes, and even more important, to capture prisoners, the major source of victims for sacrificial blades. This, as you'll remember, is what held back the Mexica when they first encountered Cortés, a desire to capture rather than kill. Nicaraguans conducted battle and war according to a set of rules that began with elaborate ceremonies to prepare for battle, offering gifts and invitation to feasts, and then progressed to skirmishes, fought more to get close enough to one's opponent to knock him senseless, or otherwise grab him and haul him away, than to kill him. This mode of fighting explains why González de Villa's 100 poorly armed men escaped all these surprise attacks without a single man killed. One was captured that we know of. And why Cordoba lost few, if any, men during his invasion. Yet the Indians were still capable of fighting with great ferocity, as indicated by a grisly story Oviedo tells us about what happened when Cordoba's army approached a chief city of the Maribillos, one of the Native American bands. He writes, quote, "When the Indians saw the daring and vigor of the Spaniards, they devised a new stratagem of war. And for this, the Indian soldiers killed many old Indians, male and female, their parents and neighbors. And they flayed them. Afterwards, they killed them and ate the meat and kept their skins. And the live Indians wore them outside with only the eyes removed, thinking, it is said, with this innovation, that the sight would scare away the Christians and frighten their horses. So when the Christians left their camp, the Indians refused to engage them in battle. Before they had formed their forward line, those Indians cloaked in the skins of others. With their bows and arrows, they started the battle in spirited fashion with many terrifying shouts. The Christians marveled at their audacity and even felt some fear under the circumstances. But falling into place, they commenced to attack the enemy and wound and killed those who had lined themselves with the flayed skins of the dead." End quote. By late spring 1524, the conquest of the Great Valley was complete. Cordoba settled León, the main city in the region, naming Soto as one of its founders. León would from now be the capital of this new colony. And here Cordoba got some bad news. 2 other Spanish expeditions were presently making their way through Nicaragua. One was only about 100 miles off, so Cordoba dispatched Soto with messages for both groups. Nicaragua was already conquered. Go home. And thus began the Wars of the Captains. It is important here to pause and consider the ramifications of Cortez's conquest of Mexico. Up to 1519, the exploration and conquest of New Spain was very much top-heavy. It was directed from Spain, mostly King Ferdinand and his court. Cortez changed everything. He did not have permission to conquer Mexico, at least not initially. But he took the initiative, and that, in the end, was rewarded because he became one of the richest men in the world. And so the lid came off of Pandora's box. Now men realized they could just take whatever they wanted and then get post facto authorization. In other words, don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. And if you have enough gold, you're probably going to get it. After all, the new King Charles V was far too concerned with affairs in Europe to micromanage these men. And as a result, anarchy, or at least near anarchy. Initially, Soto was going to take his force and confront one of the approaching captains, in this case, González de Villa, the man who had first given Soto the idea to go to Nicaragua. But then, when Cordoba heard that Cortez's old lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, was headed toward the Great Valley with 500 men, he ordered Soto to reconnoiter that army instead. Soto left that summer, 1524, at the head of a force of 80 men. But the expected showdown never happened. Alvarado pulled back to Guatemala, and so Soto rode off in the direction of González de Villa instead. It would be this event that would officially launch the War of the Captains. Soto approached de Villa's position making as much noise as he could. He wanted Davila to think he had the larger force. Davila was more cautious. Soto knew this land better than he did, and so best to make discretion the better part of valor. When the two forces finally did meet, and again, sadly, we don't have a ton of information for all of this, so it's kind of pieced together from recollections after the fact. But what we do know is when the two forces did meet, at first, Soto, even though he was badly outnumbered, had the better of it. But that night, Davila secretly sent for reinforcements. They fell upon Soto's men in the night, overwhelmed them, and took Soto captive. For Hernando de Soto, this was a humiliation unlike anything he had ever experienced. But Cordoba still appreciated Soto's efforts. He ransomed the young man back immediately, and that was because, despite his defeat in battle, Soto's aggressiveness convinced Davila that Nicaragua wasn't worth it. And so he, like Alvarado, turned around and retreated. But Davila's retreat did not end this game of conquistador whack-a-mole. Instead, new faces kept showing up. Men like Cristobal de Olid, another of Cortez's commanders. Making things worse, the governor of Panama, Pedro Davila, walked back into a fray, sending an army to punish Cordoba. Pedro Davila believed that Nicaragua fell under the auspices of his governorship in Panama. He wasn't happy that Cordoba thought he could create his own little kingdom within his territory. So, true to his unforgiving form, he promptly had Cordoba executed. Things were now getting out of hand, so Charles V tried to step in. Taking a break from his interminable European wars, he issued orders in 1525 that Spaniards in the New World were forbidden to fight one another. Though, in hindsight, he may as well have ordered the wind to stop blowing. The crown, as usual, was just too far away. Plus, Charles never did the one thing that would have made this all better. He didn't delineate clear lines of authority. He continued to just give different governors and conquistadors vague descriptions of where they might go, whom they might conquer, so on and so forth. Never mind the fact that many of these vague descriptions overlapped because nobody really knew where anything was anyway. Certainly, Soto was disappointed at this turn of events. He had hoped to carve out his own kingdom in Nicaragua. Now that wasn't going to happen. Soto's best hope at this point was that Pedro Davila might be replaced. And Charles V did recall him. Many expected that the old man would be forced into retirement. But court intrigue saved the man increasingly known as the Wrath of God. Charles V believed that Davila was the only man able to bring some form of stability to the region. So he chastised him for allowing all this chaos in the first place and executing Cordoba, and then sent him back to Nicaragua. Still, I do want you to recognize that at this point, Pedro Davila is 90 years old, or maybe even older. Many certainly were wondering how much longer he could possibly last. So for now, Soto was content to live and enrich himself in Nicaragua. In the spring of 1528, he was 28 years old and would spend the next 4 years in Nicaragua, consolidating his wealth and power. They weren't all good times. In 1528, one of Soto's closest friends died during many of the waves of plague that swept the New World during this period. Moreover, for the natives of Nicaragua and the surrounding areas, the decade of Hernando de Soto's ascendancy was basically an apocalypse. In an astonishingly short period, proud Indian city-states were obliterated, their cultures were destroyed, and their peoples implacably pushed towards extinction that would be all but complete by the end of the century. Before the conquest of Nicaragua, Bartolomé de las Casas suggested that over 1 million Indians lived in the Great Valley. a number that he said dwindled to perhaps 200,000 by 1537. Even if exaggerated, this indicates a spectacular level of decline. Las Casas, who visited the Great Valley in the mid-1520s, blames this sudden depopulation on familiar combination of warfare, forced labor, disease, and despair leading to suicide. The scope of the killing, however, staggered even his considerable imagination, as he reported murders and robberies on a scale so vast, quote, "It is not possible for the pen to relate. Upon the slightest pretext, the soldiers massacred the inhabitants without regard to age, sex, or condition. They exacted from certain measures of corn and certain numbers of slaves, and if these were not rendered, they hesitated not to kill the delinquents." End quote. While Soto was consolidating his power in Nicaragua, somewhere to the south, a chance encounter would change his life forever. In 1527, off the coast of what today is Peru, Francisco Pizarro stumbled upon the Inca Empire. He did not know it yet, but he had found the other great Mesoamerican empire. Word of Pizarro's discovery reached Nicaragua as Pizarro himself sailed back to Spain to get permission to conquer this new kingdom. Obviously, to men like Soto, this news hit like a bombshell. But for the moment, there was nothing Soto could do about it. Pedro Davila, now over 90, had sold out his interest in Peru and was determined that no one who lived in his colony would be allowed to take part in any conquest. Davila did not die until 1531, so until then, there was nothing Soto could do but cool his heels. But no one lives forever, and as I mentioned on March the 6th, 1531, Pedro Davila finally died. Soto was elated. He was now free to join up with Pizarro and make his fortune conquering a new land. Later that same month, Soto and his partner, Hernán Ponce de León, got a bump in the direction of Peru from Pizarro himself. Pizarro sent 3,000 pesos worth of gold to encourage potential conquistadors in Nicaragua to travel to Peru. Coupled with rumors of vast quantities of riches, which in this case turned out to be true, Soto had no issue recruiting men to join him on this new expedition. Francisco Pizarro now became the man who would dominate Soto's life for the next half a decade. Pizarro lacked the reckless ambition of Hernán Cortés or even Soto himself. But he certainly wanted a kingdom of his own, and he was willing to do what it took to secure one. Soto's time with Pizarro would continue training the young man for his own expedition to Florida. Now, look, we've already covered the conquest of the Inca Empire in great detail. I'm not going to repeat that all here from Soto's perspective, because to a large extent, it isn't much different. So I'm going to go through Soto's time in Peru pretty quickly, even though, to a large extent, this is where Soto would accumulate the only riches he would ever find. It took a while, but Soto and his men finally were able to link up with Pizarro's force. They were expected to see piles of gold simply sitting by the shore waiting to be loaded onto the ships, and so on and so forth. What they found instead was Pizarro's 180 miserable Spaniards, ill and pinned down by hostile natives. The newcomers were stunned. Pedro Pizarro would write, quote, "Francisco Pizarro and those who were with him received much pleasure and contentment, although those who had come did not feel the same way, because as they had left the paradise which Nicaragua was, and had found an island in revolt, lacking in food, and the greater part of the troops sick, and neither gold nor silver. Some and all wished to return whence they had come, and the captain, Soto, shamefully did not prevent the talk, nor did the principal soldiers, not being able to do so." End quote. Far more distressing for Soto was the discovery that Francisco Pizarro had already named his brother Hernando to the post of lieutenant general, or second in command. A 16th century historian reported that Soto was, quote, "not pleased," end quote. But Soto, at the end of the day, decided to stick it out with the Pizarro expedition. He knew he could out-hustle most of Francisco's brothers, as their leadership skills were, not good. And very shortly, as we'll see from his perspective, things 100% turned around. That being said, as the army prepared to leave Puna, which was the local town that they were holed up in, late in 1531, Soto remained furious over Hernando Pizarro's elevation to lieutenant general. But this didn't stop him from quickly distinguishing himself as Pizarro's most reliable captain in the field. Soto departed Puna for the mainland with 15 men, traveling 40 miles across the choppy straits on a raft, until he reached Tumbez. Soto expected a routine crossing to a friendly territory, and he didn't get it. In fact, he walked directly into a surprise attack. Luckily for Soto, for once, he actually wasn't the first one off the boats. If he had been, his life story probably ended right there, with a sudden assault by native soldiers, and a long, excruciating death by torture. Instead, this fate befell 3 young soldiers who beat their captain to the mainland. According to Pedro Cias de Leon, the men were attacked by fighters, likely Inca, as they came ashore. Hiding in the nearby bush, the natives burst out onto the beach, overwhelmed the men, and dragged them into a nearby forest. According to the same source, quote, "These wretches went ashore without suspecting anything, and they cried out as the Indians with great cruelty removed their eyes. And the barbarians hacked off their penises, and having kettles put over great fires, they put them inside and finished them off, killing them in great torment." End quote. Accounts differ slightly about what happened next, as other rafts in Soto's party came ashore. According to the same man, Soto was near enough the 3 captured men to attempt a rescue, but was turned back by a ferocious native assault. From there, Soto journeyed onward until he linked up his forces with Pizarro in Cajamarca. While I already covered events there several episodes ago, it's worth remembering that Soto, not Pizarro, was the first European to exchange words with Atahualpa. Atahualpa was roughly Soto's same age. He was also, according to his reputation, intelligent and ruthless. Again, we talked about this part in terms of the Inca Atahualpa saga before, but just to summarize from De Soto's standpoint, I think it's interesting to remember that Soto was the one who went to see Atahualpa at his camp in order to lure him within Cajamarca. When Soto arrived at the gate to the Inca palace, he found Atahualpa seated in a courtyard outside a small palace, surrounded by brilliantly clad nobles, servants, and aides. The Inca's throne was not one of the massive, imposing types that you see in all the images in medieval Europe and so on and so forth. It was a, quote, small stool very low to the ground, end quote. As if to say that Atahualpa's very person was awe-inspiring enough. He didn't need the throne. Likewise, his crown was a simple circlet of colorful beads and cords hung in a tassel. I tend to imagine this meeting of worlds because here you have, on the one hand, really this sort of paragon, this example of the height of Mesoamerican civilization seated. And there, on horseback, is the height of, I would say, Renaissance Europe, conquistador culture, staring down at them. He's there in polished armor, plumes, weapons, so on and so forth. Things that Atahualpa would have no idea what they are. And to an extent, Soto doesn't know the way this is going to go either. And at first, the effort to impress Atahualpa just falls totally flat. The Inca simply continues to just stare straight forward, as if Soto isn't even there. An awkward silence ensued, broken only when Soto prodded his mount forward so close to the Inca, quote, that the horse's nostrils stirred the fringe that the Inca had placed on his forehead, end quote. But Atahualpa never moved. He never even reacted to the horse in any sort of way. At some point, maybe tired of this, Atahualpa tells the servant to go ahead and accept a large gold ring that Soto took, quote, from his finger as a token of peace and friendship on behalf of the Christians, end quote, So, interestingly enough, this relationship actually begins with Soto, the European, giving gold to the Inca. It's going to reverse itself very soon here, as you already know. Soto then delivers a speech, and then Hernando Pizarro, who's also there, gets his part in, and he gets to explain who they are, what they're doing there, so on and so forth. Not that Atahualpa would have had any idea what's going on, but Soto, in so many ways, remains sort of the front man in all of this. And he, to a large extent, may not have understood Pizarro's full intentions as he was doing this. Still, Atahualpa, quote, gave no answer, nor did he even raise his eyes to look at the captain, that means Soto, end quote. Instead, a nearby chief answered for him. He told Soto that Atahualpa was in the midst of a religious ceremony. He was fasting. That he would tell the governor, and he means Pizarro, that he would visit him the next day in Cajamarca, which is all that Soto really had come out for in the first place. Now, keep in mind that the Spaniard situation still, by anyone's standard, was hopeless. There were only 168 of them, surrounded by tens of thousands of Inca warriors. No matter how brash and confident Soto might have been, even he must have felt that they were all quite likely to die. And, of course, we know what happens next, and I'm not going to rehash it. Against all odds, Pizarro managed to capture the Inca emperor. Now, later in life, one of Soto's loyal lieutenants would dictate a brief memorandum claiming that it was Soto who had been instrumental in the capture of Atahualpa. That may well be true, but if it is, those claims are not substantiated elsewhere. One thing that we do know is that Soto was intimately involved in the pillaging of the Inca camp. The day after Atahualpa's capture, Hernando de Soto woke up early to begin another round of marauding. He thundered out of the city gates, probably still not realizing his life had been transformed forever by what had happened the day prior. He had gone from a successful but obscure frontiersman soon to be a sensation throughout the Hispanic world and Europe in general. In the coming weeks, as word spread to the colonies and thence to Europe about the kidnapping of Atahualpa, the exploits of the flamboyant Hernando de Soto would be told over and over again throughout Spain and all its extremities. Soto became the first European to journey into the Andes. He was the first to meet Atahualpa. And he was the first to entertain Atahualpa, in fact, with a display of Castilian horsemanship before leading one of the units of cavalry in a key attack at Cajamarca. Upon arriving back in the Inca camp, Soto quickly got down to the very serious business of looting Atahualpa's tent. Given the capture of the emperor, the Inca military structure was now totally paralyzed. The army would do nothing to stop them. Just how much time Soto spent with Atahualpa from that point until his death remains disputed. Soto claims they spent hours together, and gosh, I wish we had a record of that. Just talking or playing chess, a game that Atahualpa enjoyed and he was apparently quite good at. During the following months, the Spaniards increasingly found themselves on the defensive as rumors of an impending Inca attack mounted. Soto spent the time administering the military affairs of the city, organizing supplies, supervising the legal system, paying officials, etc., etc. Certainly, I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that Hernando de Soto was the man Francisco Pizarro trusted the most outside his own family. There is also some evidence during this time that Soto took part in the torture of several high-ranking Inca commanders. Now, this is important because for centuries, historians argued that Soto was the most humanitarian of any conquistador. These incidents suggest that wasn't the case. That's not to say that Soto was any worse than Pizarro or Cortez. The reality is, he was probably about the same. And as I mentioned before, no matter how important Soto might have been to Pizarro, he always came in second to his brothers. When Francisco Pizarro divided up the initial spoils, second place went to Hernando Pizarro, not Soto. This wouldn't be the last time that Soto would be slighted in favor of a Pizarro brother. That being said, Soto received truly a staggering amount of loot at Cajamarca. Even after Almagro arrived with fresh reinforcements, Soto was Pizarro's most capable subordinate, and Pizarro rewarded him as such. One of the more confusing incidents surrounding Soto's time in Peru concerns Atahualpa's death. In the early summer of 1533, rumors flew around Cajamarca that a massive Inca army was gathering around the nearby valley of Ruminavi. There are two accounts of what happened next. In one, Pizarro dispatches Soto to investigate the rumors. While Soto was gone, more information came in, seemingly confirming the rumors, and Pizarro relented to Atahualpa's death. But that's not the only account. In the other account, Pizarro wanted to kill Atahualpa from the beginning, but he knew that Soto was staunchly against the idea. So Pizarro lied to Hernando de Soto and sent him on this errand, knowing the second Soto was gone, Atahualpa was a dead man. I'm not sure which account is true, though it is bizarre that Pizarro did not wait for Soto to return before killing Atahualpa. Soto got back a few days after Atahualpa's death and dispelled immediately the rumors of a rebel army. Why didn't Pizarro wait? Hence, there might be something to version 2. But the point that I want to make here is that while Soto wanted to keep Atahualpa alive, that wasn't out of compassion for the man. He might have liked him, true, but Soto wanted to keep Atahualpa alive because he thought a politically puppet emperor was good for business. This is important because it offers us a glimpse into how Soto is going to operate in La Florida. By and large, he is going to try to follow the Cortés playbook. Unfortunately, as he is going to find out, there just is no northern Inca empire to conquer. Soon after Atahualpa's death, Pizarro dispatched the first treasure fleet back to Spain, along with an accounting of what had transpired so far. This is important in our story because, for the first time, Europeans would have heard the name Hernando de Soto. While he never became the household name Cortés did, the notoriety of being connected to a successful conquest is not something that we should ignore. Soto would later parlay this connection into a royal license to conquer La Florida. Without the personal capital the association brought him, I'm not sure he dies in the wilderness of Arkansas. Back in Peru, Atahualpa's death did more harm than good, as Soto said it would. When news reached Pizarro that one of Atahualpa's generals intended to burn Cusco to the ground, he immediately dispatched Soto and 70 horsemen to secure the city before it could be destroyed. Soto raced an astonishing 250 miles in just 5 days and reached the city before it could be razed. On October the 29th, 1533, he divided his men into 3 squadrons and launched them at what he hoped would be a surprise attack on one of the outskirts. Unfortunately, at Villicas, outside Cusco, Soto found himself ambushed and was lucky to survive. Sure, the resulting battle ended with 600 Inca dead and only 2 Spanish horses fallen, but Soto's men suffered many wounded, several gravely. They couldn't continue playing with those kind of odds, not with only 168 men. Pizarro ordered Soto to wait for the rest of the army before he continued his advance. But now we get another tantalizing glimpse into Soto's personality. He wanted to be the first one into Cusco. This was about money, sure, but it was also about honor. Soto ignored the order, Now aware that Almagro and half of the Spanish army was effectively chasing him, and pressed on to Cusco. On November the 8th, he reached the last barrier before the city. As they approached the summit outside the town, Soto was the first to see a line of dark shapes suddenly rise up above them, followed by an instant shout that boomed and echoed across the canyon as shapes abruptly poured out from the top of the summit, 3,000 or 4,000 warriors, quote, coming down with great rapidity. Caught by utter surprise, Soto shouted to his terrified men, quote, to form a line of battle, but it was too late. The Indians were hurling a barrage of stone at them, end quote. Most of the Spaniards scattered and ran for cover, while Soto and those immediately around him tried to rush upward to take the summit. But according to one, the horses, quote, were so tired that they could not get their breath in order to attack with impetuosity such a multitude of enemies, nor did the latter cease to inconvenience and harass them, attacking them continually with lances, stones, and arrows which they hurled at them, so they were fatigued all to such an extent that the riders could hardly keep their horses at the trot or even at a walking pace. As the Indians perceived the horses' exhaustion, they began to attack with greater fury, end quote. 5 Spaniards died in the initial crush and confusion, 2 on horseback, the others on foot before they could climb into their saddles. 1 man was killed, and the natives grabbed the tail of his horse and stopped him from reaching his companions. Unable to draw his sword in the hail of missiles and swarm of maces and clubs, he was overwhelmed, dragged off his saddle, and beaten to a pulp. Another man reportedly had his head cleaved in half by the force of a single blow from a stone mace. As this bloody afternoon wore on, Soto, showing his usual presence of mind in the midst of battle, managed to muster his surviving horsemen on a flat spot near the mountain. Somehow, he held off the Incas long enough to water his horses in a small stream. This brief lull gave him the chance to rally his troops and propose a strategy. According to one, he said, quote, let us withdraw here step by step down this hillside, in such a way that the enemy may think that we are fleeing from them, in order that they may come in search of us below, for if we can attract them to this plain, we will attack them all in such a sudden manner that I hope none of them will escape from our hands. Our horses are already somewhat tired, and if we put the enemy to the flight, we shall end by gaining the summit of the mountain, end quote. At first, this strategy worked, as Soto's men backtracked and lured several hundred Incas onto a flat spot where the horses could be used effectively. But the Incas quickly caught on and retreated after losing 20 men. The battle then continued as before until twilight, with the Spaniards being pummeled from above. If night had not fallen, the Inca might have killed them all. When night fell, the 2 sides broke off fighting. The Inca positioned troops to seal off the trails and passes to the north, south, and east. On the west was the canyon and a large river. Under the cover of darkness, however, Soto was able to lead his weary men up to a nearby hill, 2 crossbow shots away from the main position. Here, he, quote, cared for his wounded and posted patrols and sentinels for the night, and ordered that all the horses remain saddled and bridled, end quote. He then attempted to rally his soldiers, telling them, quote, he thought the day to come would not be so perilous as that it had just finished, and that God our Lord, who had delivered them from danger in the past, would grant them victory in the future. And he reminded them that even when their horses were weary on that day, they had attacked their enemies from a great disadvantage, even though their own number did not exceed 50, and the enemy numbered at least 8,000. Given this, should they not hope for victory? But Soto and every other Spaniard knew the situation was desperate. They were trapped on a frigid hillside at 12,000 feet, battered and bleeding, and hemmed in by thousands of enemy troops. As if this weren't enough, Soto received intelligence that an enormous army under another Inca general was advancing rapidly. No one slept that night, as the Spaniards prayed and watched nervously for movements in the Inca camp. Then suddenly, about 1 a.m, Soto's men heard the sound off in the distance, drifting up from the canyon below. At first, they must have thought that they were dreaming, Then the noise became more distinct, and they all knew exactly what it was: a Spanish trumpet. It was the force under Diego de Almagro. They were saved. When the next day dawned, the Inca were expecting a great victory and quickly massed for an attack, only to find to their astonishment that Soto's troop had somehow doubled overnight and was dashing up the slope to attack them. Recognizing how the tables had turned, the Inca quickly disappeared into the hills, continuing their march to rendezvous with the approaching army. Almagro and Soto let them go under orders for Pizarro. If Soto felt any remorse or embarrassment over the near debacle, no one ever mentions it. Nor is there any record of Pizarro's reaction when he caught up with his renegade captain 2 or 3 days later. One imagines that Pizarro must have at least censured Hernando de Soto, whose insubordination in this matter was serious enough that a less pragmatic general might have lopped off his head. But once again, Soto's indispensability as a fighter and leader saved him. For Francisco Pizarro knew he could not advance against the combined armies before him without one of his best captains. One senses from this moment, however, Soto's days under Pizarro were definitely numbered, even as he and others braced for the final push to Cusco. On November the 14th, 2 combined Inca armies made one last desperate effort to throw back the Spaniards in the hills surrounding Cusco. Once again, native soldiers fought fiercely, at one point killing several horses and forcing a Spanish tactical retreat. But by the time that darkness fell, the Spaniards and their Indian auxiliaries had pushed the armies of the Inca into their final defensive positions outside Cusco. That evening, the Inca erected their tents and lit their fires, exhausted and feeling the intense despair of an army that on 4 occasions had come tantalizingly close to victory, but each time had failed. Battered, bloody, and 1,100 miles away from their homes in Ecuador, these Inca soldiers decided to give up the city they had fought so hard to capture throughout their long preceding civil war and had tried furiously to defend against these bizarre and unexpected ironclad warriors. That evening, they slipped away under cover of darkness, retreating into a mountainous region southwest of Cusco. At first light, the Spaniards rushed the abandoned Inca position, expecting a renewal of the previous day's fighting. Instead, they found an empty hillside of smoldering ashes, llama dung, and hastily discarded baggage. The battle for Cusco was over. Soto, Almagro, and the rest quickly entered the city and took up some of the best lodgings that they could find. But Soto had little time to enjoy these new luxuries, as fresh reports came in from scouts that another army had been sighted just 20 miles southwest of the city. This prompted Pizarro to dispatch Soto to investigate, and if possible, to smash or at least drive away the enemy. As usual for his personality, Soto could hardly wait to give up his luxurious new life to dash back to the wilds. In fact, he moved so quickly out of Cusco that he overran a small contingent of a retreating Inca army in a bad pass just before a canyon. These men were able to hold off Soto's advance long enough for the Inca commander to burn the bridge behind them, a strategic victory that forced Soto into a highly vulnerable position, having to ford a river deep in a canyon, where the Inca forces perched on a high bluff were able to hurl down a steady barrage of rocks, spears, and arrows as the Spaniards attempted to cross the river. This gave the Inca commander enough time to pull back into a region of high, rugged valleys and ridges to the west. Once across the river, Soto pursued the Inca army for 10 more days before calling off the chase, telling Pizarro when he returned to Cusco that this region was, quote, the wildest and most inaccessible they had ever seen, end quote. But he brought the good news that the Inca general was decisively moving away from the capital and was no longer close enough to threaten it. Soto arrived back in Cusco in late July or early August, this time with Manco Inca in tow, and quickly restored order to the capital city. Immediately thereafter, Soto, as was planned, was sworn in as lieutenant governor of Cusco, but we have little documents from this period, so there's not many specifics when it comes to Soto's actions, etc., etc. My guess is he probably was dealing with the day-to-day business of administering to a region, and essentially establishing a kingdom, while Pizarro, as we know, was off building what would become Lima. The biggest issue we know he dealt with was dividing up the property amongst the different factions present. And by property, I mean that literally. By and large, we're talking about encomiendas here. At first, Soto seemed reluctant to divide up anything. But when he did, Soto did a fair job of it. He didn't favor the Pizarro faction, as they no doubt expected him to. And during this time, Soto brought two men into his inner circle who are going to be instrumental in his operations in North America. One was Juan Ruiz Loibo, and the other was Luis de Moscasco. Both men would accompany him back to Spain and then to La Florida. I mention them now because Soto came close to them while both were in Cusco. By the spring of 1535, the odds of Soto doing what he really wanted, that is, conquering his own slice of the Inca Empire, were in steep decline. There were already 2 unauthorized expeditions to the north. And to the south, word reached Peru that spring that Charles V had decided to give it to Diego de Almagro. Not that there was anything worth having to the south anyway. But Almagro's arrival that spring in Cusco complicated things for Soto. At the moment, no one knew that Almagro had been awarded what is today Chile. Instead, Pizarro now declared Almagro the new lord of Cusco. But his brother, Hernando Pizarro, was determined not to let Almagro take up that position. Evidently, on one occasion, Hernando drew his sword on Soto, who was just kind of in the middle on this, demanding that he side with him. Soto calmly told him to put the weapon down and stop, quote, looking for scandals, end quote. This was not the end of the incident, however. For, quote, when Almagro heard about this, he said that Juan and Gonzalo Pizarro were fickle and sniveling brats, and he sent many horsemen from among his allies to protect the messenger, end quote. He also demanded that Soto, as the chief magistrate of the city, return to the Pizarro's palace and place Juan Pizarro under house arrest so that he could not leave the city. This demand forced Soto to decide between the two camps, since to arrest Juan Pizarro would make him an enemy of the Pizarro family, and not to arrest him would alienate Diego de Almagro. In the end, Soto's decision was easy. Pizarro was obviously pushing him out, even as Almagro was becoming master of the next phase of conquest in the south, where everyone assumed, again, this is before the march to the south, that there'd be more Cajamarcas, more Cuscos, more rooms filled with gold. Thus, as a contemporary historian notes, Soto at this point abandoned any semblance of impartiality and jumped, quote, in bed with Almagro and supported his interests. Soto must have realized that Juan Pizarro wasn't going to give himself up to arrest easily. Still, he walked across the hot, pebble-strewn plaza to the Casana Palace, dressed in his magistrate's clothes and accompanied by the city's constable and a small guard. He demanded the young Pizarro and his men turn over their arms and remain under house arrest. To which Juan responded with bitterness and pride, screaming more obscenities and insults at Soto before once again grabbing a lance to wave in Soto's direction. By now, Hernando de Soto had had enough of this. Always preferring action to talk, he grabbed a lance himself from one of his guards and challenged Juan Pizarro to fight in the plaza. Ready to brawl, the two men strolled out into the bright sunshine under the peaks that surround Cusco. Here, Hernando de Soto and Juan Pizarro threw off their capes as a crowd of visitors watched the spectacle of two of their most senior leaders swinging heavy weapons at each other, glancing off blows, and attempting to knock each other to the ground. But both men were stout and muscular and expert fighters, which meant the duel continued for some time without either man gaining the advantage. As the fight wore on, word spread quickly to the followers of Pizarro, Almagro, and Soto, who armed themselves and rushed to the plaza, threatening to escalate the conflict. What happens next is not clear. Our main historian wasn't present, but he claims that Juan Pizarro abruptly broke off the duel and retired to his palace when it became clear his followers were too few to defeat his enemies. Eyewitnesses claim that a recently arrived royal treasurer, a guy by the name of Antonio Teles de Guzman, stopped the fight dramatically by grabbing a weapon of his own and leaping between Soto and Pizarro, holding up his lance and shouting to the combatants, quote, "The Spaniards were too far in number to battle against themselves, and if the two sides started fighting, the Indians would kill those who survived and the city would be lost," end quote. Hearing these words, this version of the story at least, Soto cooled down and realized that his duty was to stop the fight, which he did, though he was unwilling to excuse what had happened. Returning to his own house in a rage, he issued orders forbidding the Pizarros to leave the city, and then he sent his constable and presumably a large unit of armed deputies to arrest Juan Pizarro, who apparently surrendered without a fight and was taken to the city jail. Again, our contemporary historian adds that neither party acted with impartiality or wisdom during this whole affair, though he mostly blames the 24-year-old Juan Pizarro, whom he says was, quote, always turbulent and filled with envy for one another, end quote. Even in jail, according to this man, the young Pizarro threatened to, quote, go out and kill everyone, end quote. Soon afterwards, Francisco Pizarro himself arrived in Cusco to defuse the situation, bringing with him the king's actual concession to Almagro. Now, once things calmed down, Pizarro turned on Soto for openly siding with Almagro. But now, Soto realized he had no future with the Pizarros, and so he made one last-ditch effort to remain in Peru. He offered his services to Diego de Almagro, who was to lead the expedition south. Certainly, Soto was the best military man available, and probably the best for the job. But Almagro wanted loyalty, not skill, and so chose Rodrigo de Ordoñez instead as his second in command. Soto, watching Almagro depart south with his army on July the 5th, 1535, realized his time in Peru was over. He would return to Spain and ask the king for fresh lands to conquer. In late 1535, he left Peru for Spain, along with enough treasure to bribe court officials, pay for the expedition, and entice young recruits. He probably left before the winter storms began in November. At this point, Soto would have been 35 years old. He had become vastly wealthier than he could have ever dreamt of, but it wasn't enough. For Soto was very much like Alexander the Great. He just wanted to see what was over that next hill. He wanted greater glory, fortune, and success. And now his path led him back to Europe and the court of Charles V.